the Supreme Court decided that a border official looking at returning green card holders has no real burden of proof in establishing that a green card holder has committed a crime. It's kind of a scary decision because it doesn't put any burden whatsoever on the border official.
Welcome to Statutes of Liberty, an immigration podcast brought to you by Klasko Immigration Law Partners. Join us as we unravel the ins and outs of immigration policy, from the issues of today to the historic basis for laws already in place.
Welcome to our two-part podcast on naturalization. I'm Megan Kludt. I'm a senior attorney at Klasko Immigration Law Partners. And I'm joined by my wonderful colleagues, Senior Counsel Stacy Shore and partner here, Karuna Simbeck. And today we're going to cover the basics of naturalization, and that is the process of applying to become a U.S. citizen. We thought this topic was very timely. We just celebrated our nation's semi-quincentennial a few days ago, and that has prompted a lot of reflection about what it means to be American. We've all been watching the World Cup and seen national pride on display and what it means to be from a country and support your country. And we also had a major decision last week from the Supreme Court about birthright citizenship. So it's definitely a hot topic right now, what it means to be a U.S. citizen. So in the U.S., we have lawful permanent residents, what we call green card holders, and naturalization is the process of becoming a U.S. citizen, no longer green card holder. So Karuna, I'd like to ask you, why would someone choose to start the naturalization process? Are there any benefits that come with that certificate?
Good question, Megan. And like you said, it's so timely. I actually happen to be celebrating my 10th year anniversary as a US citizen. So I know firsthand what the advantages can be. Like you said, we start off as green card holders. And so when you're a green card holder, you have certain things you need to do, which include renewing your green card. So your green card is valid for 10 years. You have to file an I-90 to get it renewed. Or guess what? If you apply for naturalization, you don't have to worry about renewing your green card anymore. It's one less immigration process. You don't have to worry about legal fees, filing fees, all of which, is a part of the renewal process. You don't have to worry about what to do when your green card expires and you need to travel. So, it might seem like it's a small benefit, but it can have significant impacts because these administrative things can really be very challenging. That's just one advantage. A US passport, I think that really makes a big difference for international travel. There are countries that if you have a US passport, you don't need a visa. You might just have, registration requirements. It definitely makes it easier when you're coming back into the country as well, because, you don't have to go through the same queues as other folks. Having a US passport definitely makes things easier. I remember, this was part of international travel. I remember when I didn't have my US passport, my husband and I were coming back from a trip. We were stuck in Switzerland at the Zurich airport, and there was just absolute chaos because of weather. And so we were going around trying to figure out from airlines, hey, can we get a different flight? And they said, yes, there's a flight available, but you'll have to go to a different terminal. Well, we walked what felt like miles, got to this different terminal. And when they looked at our passports, they said, well, your husband can go because he has a US passport, but you can't leave this terminal because you don't have a US passport. So it just makes such a big difference when you have a US passport. So the other big advantage, of course, is the right to vote, right? You get to vote in federal elections, in state and local elections. You get to, you have a voice in shaping government policy. And I think that is such a huge benefit. I want to say that ever since I moved to this country, I find myself more involved in voting. I feel like the average person here really, really cares. And I think that that makes a big difference. One of the other advantages of applying for naturalization is that that doesn't mean you have to renounce citizenship from other countries. Like US law does not require that. Now, on the other hand, your country might require you to renounce that citizenship, but under US law, you can still have citizenship of other countries. Megan, this one I'm going to turn to you. Um, you know, like you mentioned, we had a couple of Supreme Court judgments last week. I think there's an advantage that U.S. citizens have that green card holders don't, which is greater scrutiny when they enter the U.S. when you enter on a green card. I know you recently wrote an article on that. Do you want to talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, and what this really comes down to is that green card holders, although they mostly are safe, don't have to worry about ICE and detention and any of that stuff that has been in the news for the last year and a half, green card holders are more vulnerable than US citizens and are subject to removal from the United States in some cases, and in some cases also detention. So the two big reasons why somebody might lose a green card, one is extensive travel. If somebody spends too long outside of the US, they can actually lose their green card, come back in, be sent to an immigration judge who might determine they let it go by leaving for too long, and then they may actually have a deportation order from the US. That's one scenario. And the other involves any kind of criminal activity. So there are certain crimes that can make a green card holder deportable from the US. So it's not complete security. If you're a US citizen, you will have to go through the criminal justice system, but you're not worrying about deportation. And this is particularly an issue for people who have a criminal issue or maybe even a charge if they haven't even been convicted and they are traveling outside of the United States. Because when a green card holder is traveling and they come back in, they can actually be treated with greater scrutiny. So if a border officer believes that a green card holder has committed a certain crime, they may not admit them as a normal green card holder, but they admit them as something we call an applicant for admission, which means they have fewer rights. They may be detained when they come in, and then they have to see an immigration judge about whether they are allowed to stay. Now, this has always been the case, but the all the news last week, or I guess a couple of weeks ago, on that Supreme Court decision, is the Supreme Court decided that a border official looking at returning green card holders has no real burden of proof in establishing that a green card holder has committed a crime. So, in that case, somebody had been charged with a crime but not been convicted of it, and a border official decided that that was enough to send them over to the immigration judge. So, it's kind of a scary decision because it doesn't put any burden whatsoever on the border officials. They could just suspect that someone has committed a crime. So this does make it much more nerve-wracking for green card holders, lawful permanent residents, and that's something that you don't have to worry about anymore when you apply for your US citizenship. I was just going to ask if there are any other benefits, advantages to having citizenship that you could think of.
Absolutely. So there are certain things that only U.S. citizens have permission for. For example, eligibility for certain federal jobs, for certain government security clearances, access to federal grants. That might be just limited to U.S. citizens. The ability to sponsor some of your family members, right, without them being in a green card queue and taking years for that to process. Some children might automatically acquire citizenship based on their parents' citizenship. I think one of the other advantages is when you're a green card holder, like Megan, you mentioned earlier, if you spent a considerable time outside of the United States, then again, there's scrutiny on whether you're really maintaining your residency in the United States. And so for green card holders who are going to spend significant time outside of the United States, either because they have multiple businesses or they have family they need to take care of, then they have to file what's called a reentry permit application. So they're preserving their green cards. Otherwise, there's more scrutiny on them and whether they're maintaining any ties to the United States. So again, US citizen, you could spend as much as time outside of the United States without being questioned. So I think that makes a big difference. It also is just a meaningful personal milestone, right? You know, going to the naturalization interview, learning those, and I know like Stacy is going to talk about this a little bit later, but going through the test, going through the oath ceremony, it just feels very meaningful because you are making a choice here. So, to me, that also made a big difference.
They have these final ceremonies sometimes in, historic places. I used to live in Boston, and they would have oath ceremonies in Faneuil Hall, which is a historic building. And sometimes you walk by it, and you just see families from all over the world with American flags and just tearful and crying because they're so proud to have reached this landmark. So it's very moving for us as immigration attorneys. So yes, let's turn it over to Stacy. Stacy, could you tell us a little bit about who is actually qualified to apply for naturalization? Is it anybody who gets here? And sometimes politicians make it sound like anybody that gets over the border can vote in US elections and be US citizens. What is actually required?
Not quite that easy. Thank you, Megan. So you must be at least 18 years old to apply. You must have been a permanent resident for at least 5 years. Or if you're married to a US citizen, regardless of how you got your green card, 3 years. You need to pass an English test, a civics test, and then you also need to prove continuous residence, physical presence, and good moral character. So, what is continuous residence? It means you must maintain a domicile in the United States without abandoning it for the 3 or 5 years prior to filing. So, for example, if you've traveled abroad and you remained outside for more than 180 days, but less than 365 days, there's a presumption that you broke your continuous residence. And Megan mentioned this earlier. The burden is on you to prove that you did not intend to abandon your permanent resident status. So you can show ties to the United States, proof that you filed your US taxes, that you own property or have an active lease, that you have a US employer, pay stubs, and other financial ties to the United States. So if you've traveled abroad and remained outside the United States for more than 365 days, then you've broken the continuity of residence. And actually, you might have trouble getting back in if you didn't file a reentry permit, like Karuna had mentioned earlier, before you left. So before filing for naturalization, you might need to reestablish your residency for at least 4 years and 1 day if you're subject to the 5-year rule, or 2 years and 1 day if you're subject to the 3-year rule. What is physical presence? Physical presence is the actual cumulative number of days spent inside the United States. So if you've traveled a lot and you want to count how many days that you've been in the United States, any part of a day that you've spent on US soil counts. And that includes the day you left and the day that you came back. And days in US territories count. So you must have been physically present in the US for at least half of the past 5 years, or if you're eligible, the past 3 years. And that's 30 months out of the last 5 years, in case math is hard, and 18 months out of the last 3 years. Now, you can maintain continuous residence, but still fail the physical presence if you take too many trips abroad. Or even if you don't travel often and you only leave the US once, but you do it for more than a year, you can fail to maintain continuous residence even though you've accrued sufficient physical presence. There's also an exception called 319B that protects both your physical presence and continuous residence requirements for spouses of US citizens who are working for qualifying employers overseas. So we also mentioned good moral character, and you have to demonstrate that you have good moral character. And Megan had mentioned criminal acts that can go against you in proving that, but also failing to pay taxes can make you ineligible. You're also going to have to take an English test, and they're testing your ability to read, write, and speak English. So they may ask you up to 3 sentences, and you have to read at least one of those correctly. For the writing test, you may be asked to write at least up to 3 sentences, and you have to write one of those successfully to pass. There are some limited exceptions, and there are lots of resources on the USCIS website where you can practice. Also, for the civics test, which many US citizens cannot pass themselves, unfortunately, the civics test evaluates your knowledge of American history, government, and geography. And so for folks who have filed after October 20th, 2025, there are 20 civics questions from 128 possible questions, and you have to answer 12. So 12 out of the 20 have to be answered correctly in order to pass.
So you're saying I might not pass because it's going to test on things that I learned, as somebody born here and a US citizen, I learned these things, as a freshman in high school,
Correct.
I know.
if I did at all.
It takes me
Exactly.
back to my time when I was studying for the test. And I know I would study for the test, and then every day I would have my husband quiz me on those questions because it is really different when you're reading a question versus someone asking you that question. So I made sure, because I knew the officer was going to ask me the question, that I actually had my husband question me at dinner every night. Um, it was you don't really remember those questions once you're done.
But some of them are easy. Some of them are just about, the oceans on either side of the continent. And then other ones will be who signed the declaration. So they range, so you can focus on the questions that are the hardest and then practice those.
And I do want to go back to something Stacy mentioned earlier about, spending time outside of the United States, which can break your clock and the burden is on you. We saw this happen during COVID, right? People were stranded. Airlines had canceled flights. And just, sometimes things are absolutely outside of your control. And I think that's what you really need to show, that you had no control over what happened. And that you did maintain those ties. So for so many of those family members who were stuck outside because, they'd gone to sell their properties or gone to meet family, and then they get stuck outside of the United States, they were able to demonstrate that they have kids here, they have grandchildren here, they have homes here. So I think all of those things are considered, when officers are making those adjudications. But I've also seen it make a difference between the different field offices, because ultimately, when you go to these interviews, it's going to be at your local field office, and the policies can sometimes differ in these places, in these offices.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's just to reiterate, Stacy was talking about there's two different presence tests you have to meet. One is, have you accumulated enough days? And that is just a matter of counting, and there's nothing subjective about it. But the other one is, did you have a continuous period of residence with no break, an unbroken period of residence? And this concept of residence and home, and what does it mean to break your residence? And this can be very subjective depending on an officer. So if I am working at my job and I take a trip for 3 months to visit family overseas, but then, somebody I'm visiting fell ill and I decided to stay longer and I took time off of work. At what point, or is there a point when I've lost my connection, my residence in the United States? So it does sometimes get into these ideas of what is home, when does home change? And that can be very a different perspective depending on which officer is looking at your case.
And I would say the best gauge is that 180 days, that try to return before 180 days if you can, to avoid any presumption of abandonment.
And Stacy, what happens if somebody has been out of the United States for a year or more?
Well, they've broken the continuity. If they're outside still, they could have trouble getting back into the United States. But if they are able to get back in, some CBP officers will ask them to see a judge and go to court and defend their green card. Others will allow them in. Maybe they have a letter from a doctor or from an employer saying why they were stuck abroad for that period of time. And if you are allowed back in, you should still be able to apply for naturalization, but you might want to wait. You might want to, give it at least a year or two, depending on how long you need to prove that you were a permanent resident, whether it's the 3-year rule or the 5-year rule. But you can reestablish your residency. And other reasons that why you may want to wait or might why you may not want to file naturalization at this time, you need to make sure you've paid your child support. If you're an eligible male and you haven't registered for selective service, you need to make sure that you do that. Or maybe you're having trouble with English. Maybe you can speak English, but you can't write English. And so you need to practice, take some classes to make sure that you can pass that test unless you qualify for one of those exemptions. If you've been arrested, if it's been recent and your situation hasn't gone through the process and there's no court disposition, you might want to wait and see what happens with that before applying for naturalization. You also want to make sure that your criminal attorney is aware of the immigration implications of any plea deal or a conviction. And keep in mind, if you have convictions, even if your record was expunged, even if your record was sealed when you were a minor, you still need to disclose that information. And so you should talk to an immigration attorney before you apply for naturalization, because you don't want to get into a situation where not only is your naturalization denied, but then you're put into proceedings to have your green card taken away.
Yes. And under this administration, there was a memo that came out, I believe, last September, that talked a lot about what it means to have the good moral character that is required to apply for U.S. citizenship, which of course raised questions about what does good moral character mean? What do we have to show? Is it just the absence of criminal activity, or is there something more? And that's something we're actually going to get into a little bit more in our next session, where we're going to get into complications and pitfalls. So please stay tuned for our next session as well. Karuna, I'm going to turn it back to you. Could you walk us through the actual process once you've decided that you're eligible? You've talked to your attorney, Stacy. She says it looks good. What are the actual steps you need to take at that point to get through the process?
Yeah. So the process is filing the N400 form with USCIS with certain documents and information. And for most people who don't have, concerns about having spent too much time outside of the United States, have any criminal issues, have any underlying immigration violations, it can be a very, very smooth process and really quick. I sat on my own application for 2 years. I don't know why, but it can be so quick. You could be ready with that application in a day if you have all of the materials. Basically, it's filling out the form. You're going to collect the documents, which is your green card, your tax records, your travel history, just because you want to show USCIS, you do want to record all of your trips in the last 5 years or 3 years to show that you've met both continuous and physical presence. And once you are a green card holder, you no longer have what's called an I-94 admission record. So, which means you have to demonstrate your trips through airline tickets and things like that to show how long you were outside of the United States. You will need your marriage records, divorce records. And of course, if you have any criminal issues, you definitely want to bring that to your attorney's attention. It is mind boggling to me how many attorneys find out at the client's interview that there is a criminal record because the client hasn't mentioned that before. So it's really, really important, especially now, to make sure that if you have that criminal record, to bring that up with your attorney. The form can be filed by paper or it can be filed online. It seems like anything that's filed online gets processed a little bit quicker than a paper filing. Once you file, you get scheduled for a biometrics appointment at which they fingerprint you and they take a photograph. The fingerprints are run through a database to just make sure you don't have any criminal history. So, which is why it's important to bring that up if you do have any issues, because it is going to show up during the naturalization application. And really, when you file a naturalization application, it's sort of like the officer going through your immigration history, right? They have your entire immigration file with them. So it's important that there is consistency in your immigration history. If there have been issues, you definitely want to resolve them before you file the naturalization application. Once you're done with the biometrics, you get scheduled for an interview. And as Stacy mentioned, you have at the interview, you have a civics test and English test. The officer is going to ask you some basic questions. If so for example, if you got your green card based on a marriage, but you got divorced during that process, there's a chance that the officer is going to want to make sure that the marriage was actually entered in good faith. So they are sort of going to do that look back. They are going to check that there was no fraud, misrepresentation in how you got your green card. So, the officer does take a long look at your background information. We've had situations where after the clients got their green card, but before they naturalized, they've had speeding tickets on minor offenses, but they forgot to mention that in their N400. And as we're going to the interview, they're like, I remember that this is what happened. So, what do you do in a situation like that, right? It's always better to be honest with the officer and bring that up and say, I am so sorry. I forgot to mention this. This was a minor offense. But here are the records. So that honesty goes a long way. Of course, if it's more than a minor offense, then you don't want to bring that up for the first time at an interview. You want to have that conversation with your attorney beforehand.
Can I ask what is the setting like for these interviews? Does this happen in a courthouse? Is there a judge involved? What's
Yeah,
the vibe?
it's generally in a USCIS office, in a local field office. You go to the building, there's actual security, like you're at an airport. You get assigned a particular officer. They swear you in, and then the officer will ask you questions. So it's just you and the officer in the room. If you have an attorney, your attorney can go with you, really, but your attorney's presence is, just in case something critical comes up. That only then will the attorney actually jump in. But otherwise, the attorney's job really is to stay quiet. So yeah, you are not allowed to take any family members in with you for the interview. So unlike the green card process, whether it's a family based or an employment based, if you and your spouse are being interviewed, or both are scheduled for interviews or green card applications, you generally go into the interview together. You're interviewed together. Each of you are asked questions. Here, your family members cannot go in with you, so they'll be sitting in the waiting room while you go through the interview process.
Do you recommend that individuals take attorneys with them?
I think it really depends. I think if you really have a clean background, no issues, there's been no problems, I don't think you need an attorney. I do think you need an attorney in helping with the prep, right? Because that's when clients might not realize that they had issues. And it's only when an attorney is reviewing the case, they'll be like, well, we see this was a problem, this was not disclosed, or this is something that should have been discussed before you file the application. But otherwise, I don't think you need an attorney if you have a straightforward case. I do think you need an attorney if there's something you're worried about. Sometimes clients just want you there for moral support, right? So
Sometimes we enjoy being there to watch the end of our process if it's a client we've been working with for
that's right.
8 years.
Yeah. Well, so let me turn the question back to you both. Do you think a client needs an attorney or should have an attorney at the NAPS interview?
Well, I will say I have heard I definitely know attorneys whose position is that if you're representing the client, you should always be at the interview. But on the other hand, a lot of my experiences at the Lawrence field office up in Massachusetts, and for a lot of the time I was practicing there, they would have days that they focused on naturalization cases, and they just seemed much more laid back. The officers were just in a better mood. They were expecting simpler cases, and you bring in a lawyer with you, and all of a sudden you're a little more on edge. And I did have a wonderful officer once look at my client's file while I was sitting there, and she said, "Well, this all looks straightforward. So why are you here?" So there have been cases where I wonder if just our presence suggests to the officer that maybe there is something in the file that they should be thinking about, since this individual has paid money to make sure a lawyer is with them. So I and I love going to these interviews. I think attorneys enjoy it. It's wonderful to be at your client's side at that final moment, especially if you've worked together for a long time. And I think it feels really good for the client too, to just know that you're there in case anything goes wrong. And sometimes things do go wrong, and sometimes an officer makes mistakes. I've had a case where somebody had a very straightforward, I thought, physical and continuous residence situation, and an officer interpreted one of my client's trips in a surprising way, and actually encouraged the client to withdraw her own application, saying that if you don't withdraw it, I'm going to have to deny it. And so she withdrew it, which left me with no options to later appeal it or argue the decision. So there are things that can go wrong. So I tend to, if it were me, I would probably take a lawyer no matter what. But many, many, many people do these as more than any other type of immigration benefit. I believe that many people do this on their own successfully.
I think it's important to note, when you're paying a lawyer to prepare the naturalization application for you, there's a separate fee if you want them to attend the interview. I think that depending on whether you have that flexibility, like you said, Megan, you would bring someone with you. So, why not if you have that ability? But the most important thing is to have that attorney look at your background, go back to when you got your green card. Before then, how did you get it from the very first time that you entered the United States? Really looking back and making sure that there isn't anything in your history that may come up at the naturalization interview, even if it's 10, 15, 20 years later, you may have forgotten. But if USCIS has access to information and it's derogatory, they may use it to deny the case. So you want to make sure you have a lawyer who looks at your background, not just preparing the application itself. And if you can afford to have an attorney come with you, then that's the best case scenario.
And that cost question can depend on how far away you and your attorney are from that local office. In my case, where I practiced, it was a 2-hour drive to our closest USCIS office. And I know that there are people around the country who have even further drives. So, paying an attorney to travel maybe 5, 6 hours round trip, where you have a really straightforward case and they're really just going to be sitting there being quiet and giving you moral support, maybe a difficult thing to swallow. So there's a lot of factors that come into play.
Yeah, and with the, you know, new policy on good moral character, there might be more of a reason for even straightforward cases for clients to want to have us along with them.
Absolutely. And one thing just to keep in mind is the cost may be a lot, but this is a very big foundational moment. And you do want everything to go right. And Karuna, did you mention what happens when you get out of that interview? Do you walk out a US citizen?
No, you do not. Well, the local field offices used to have the option where once you completed your interview and they would make a decision right away, and you could do your oath ceremony the same day. That has not been the practice now for some time. And so once the interview is complete, you get a separate notice to attend an oath ceremony. And the oath ceremony is generally in the local field office. But if you're changing your name, it can be in a courthouse. So, and the ceremonies can, it's the same sort of ceremonies, just in two different locations. I wanted to briefly talk about the processing times as well. We've seen the timings fluctuate. We've seen people get scheduled for interviews, within a few months of filing. In some field offices, which have a higher workload, like for New York, it could take, closer to a year. And then once you've completed your test and the initial interview, between that and the oath ceremony, it could be a few weeks to a couple of months. And so when you go to the oath ceremony, you are going to relinquish your green card and any other EADs and advanced paroles that you have. And then once you are sworn in, you will have your naturalization certificate. You can use that naturalization certificate to apply for your US passport.
Yes, and just remember, it is not done until you get to that oath ceremony.
Yes.
So if you have a crime you're waiting to commit, anything that goes wrong between the interview and the oath ceremony can still be a problem. You have to continue to qualify for naturalization all the way up to when you swear that oath. I would just add about the oath ceremonies that courts can do it. It depends a little bit about on the state and how they handle it. In Massachusetts, they were able to, and sometimes during COVID, would do the swearing in ceremony at the USCIS office, but mostly they get scheduled in different courts and locations around the state. So my clients would often get scheduled for their oath ceremony much closer to their home than they had to travel for their USCIS interview. And it also that gives the opportunity for them to turn it into interesting occasions. So there are often oath ceremonies that are scheduled on the 4th of July, especially, and sometimes there will be special speakers at those ceremonies. And they can take place at historical buildings like Faneuil Hall. Often they'll be in local schools. So, but some of these ceremonies, they really make an effort to make it a special event that everyone can come to and witness. And it can be really beautiful if you get a chance to go witness one. It's a great experience. All right. Well, thank you everyone for tuning in. And we hope to see you at our next session.
Thank you for listening to Statutes of Liberty, an immigration podcast brought to you by Klasko Immigration Law Partners. For more information, visit us at klaskolaw.com. Follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. You can email your immigration questions to podcast@klaskolaw.com. The materials contained in this podcast does not constitute direct legal advice and is for informational purposes only. An attorney-client relationship is not created by listening to or accessing this podcast. The information provided should never replace informed counsel regarding specific immigration matters.